light, and mind. Throughout the duration of this session, we welcome you to submit your questions using the chat box and to be as specific as possible when doing so. We'll follow up with your questions after the conclusion of the formal presentation. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to our presenter.
Hello, this is Lindsay Stefans, and I will be talking to you today about light and mind. So here are some of the learning objectives which you can read. And I'll get started. So the design of the built environment, architectural lighting, mindfulness, and neuroscience are all established fields in and of themselves. However, bringing them together is both exploratory and experimental, and it reflects my varying interests, creative work, and research. As a professional, I've experienced in the first two. My interest in neuroscience has been decades long, and particularly in the past 5 years. However, I am by no means a neuroscientist. But I've been keeping up on a lot of the findings between neuroscience, neuropsychology, and those have affected my work and observations and continuing investigations. So in addition to my own work and the reading I've done, I've also interviewed some scientists and connected with various organizations in the fields of neuroarchitecture, conscious design, and meditation research. The field of neuroscience itself is relatively new. It emerged as its own discipline in the late 1950s and early 60s, which is about the same time as architectural lighting design emerged as its own distinct discipline. And neuroscience is also multidisciplinary, so it combines physiology, anatomy, molecular biology, developmental biology, cytology, computer science, and mathematical modeling. So in neuroscience, we're looking at circuits, and this relates to what we learn about learning, memory, behavior, and perception. So within the field of cognitive neuroscience, biology and psychology kind of come together. So at this point, there are now thousands of published studies on meditation and brain health and behavior. So it's no longer an obscure subject. It's actually quite prevalent, and lots of papers have already been published. Major institutions like Harvard Medical School, University of Massachusetts Medical School have all conducted studies using both long-term and short-term meditators and looked at their effects on our biology. They use things like EEGs, which are electroencephalograms, which measure electrical signals, and also fMRI scans. So those are functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that measures blood flow in the brain. So if you just do a search online for meditation, brain science, or neuroplasticity, you'll find literally hundreds of sources to read. So I'm just going to sort of touch upon some of the topics that relate to how I'm connecting these various fields. So, and if we look there at the other connection, it's between neuroscience and the design of the built environment. And that's a field that's emerged in the past 2 decades. The neuroscience of the experience of architecture is also called neuroarchitecture, and that's also transdisciplinary. So in this talk, I'm going to look at sort of the crossroads of all 3 of these, with a particular focus on light within the built environment, as that's my professional design experience, and from where I draw my hypotheses. And my interest kind of in these subjects relates to well-being, and looking at ways that how I can affect change within the realm of the built environment and with my own capacity and capability and experience. So well-being is a kind of a big subject. So of course that relates to various factors: cultural differences, socioeconomic status, health, psychological states, and also relationships, interpersonal relationships. So I see my role in this as both sort of practical and clinical, meaning as a designer, practitioner, to connect these and sort of bring awareness to the various efforts that are going on within the fields of meditation, brain science, and neuroarchitecture. There are lots of interesting people that are looking at issues of well-being from various disciplines and, of course, design. And we spend approximately 93% of our lives indoors, so this is definitely important. And if we look at this in the context of how we're living in the modern age, which you can also call like the attention economy, this is very important. So our attention is really a resource. So, and how our attention, what we attend to, that definitely affects our physiology. And it also plays a critical role in cognitive functions and memory, etc. So I will sort of bring this around and you'll get a little bit better idea as I progress through. So just bear with me. So these are images from just a recent stroll I took to a Rite Aid. So we can see here that the topic of neurophysiological health, it's not just for scientists in the lab. You could say that it's, the topic is quite pervasive. How to manage stress, what happens to the brain. So meditation has also made it to the checkout line. In the West, it's becoming less obscure and shrouded in mystery. So you can see an image there. There's even a puzzle and game book designed around breathing and awareness of cultivation, a mindfulness journal, and a magazine of various techniques. So you could say that the science of meditation is starting to become popularized. So I just returned from a site visit in Manhattan where I was checking the install for 2 floors of amenity spaces in a commercial office building in Midtown. So excuse the non-professional photos. The project is still in construction, almost finished. And the project was for an office building, 2 floors of amenity spaces for the commercial office tenants. So there are some typical spaces: meeting rooms, lounges, a cafe, a roof deck. But the project also had a small meditation room. And we're seeing this more in our projects, which I think is great. And I think it also speaks to a growing demand for these types of spaces. And in this case, the room was small, but we provided a color changing cove that the user could control by themselves with a simple wall station. And the room also doubled as a mother's room. So in this tiny room, the lighting really served as perhaps one of the main features of this small kind of windowless environment. So it's just a place to escape and unplug. So meditation and mindfulness, these are indeed big subjects, and they can be spoken of in historical or in ancient contexts or as a contemporary practice. But those two really cannot be separated. However, this is not an academic presentation on the origins of mindfulness meditation by any means, but I would like to introduce some concepts as this relates to healthy spaces of wellness, looking at that from a cognitive and emotional perspective. So mindfulness, what is mindfulness? In short, it is paying attention to the present with a non-judgmental attitude. So it's part of our basic human ability to be present and aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not being overly reactive by what's going on around us. So that's what mindfulness is. And meditation is a practice where you can use this technique. So these techniques are used to, train awareness and attention, which certainly relates to this idea of like our well-being. So if you look at well-being in terms of flourishing and suffering, the practice of meditation is certainly intended for the former. So from a neurological perspective, a mind that we call a flourishing mind has certain characteristics that can be observed. So meditation practices, they sort of regulate the processes in the mind. And there have been many studies that show that with a diminished ability to step back and observe the internal processes, this can cause, various psychiatric conditions, including depression and anxiety. So there's definitely, these are related topics, which I'll talk a little bit about: meditation, depression, and anxiety. So there's also some similar findings that looks at meditation in the treatment of addiction and how this relates to the mind's ability to observe these internal processes of thinking. And so mindfulness training can be found to increase attentional stability. And that relates to kind of focus, I guess you could say it in sort of a summarized way. Focus, attentional stability. So researchers at the University of Wisconsin, the Healthy Minds Lab, and the Lyon Neuroscience Research Center, they've come up with some terminology to sort of classify different types of meditation practice. So I'm just going to briefly sort of touch upon attentional, constructive, and deconstructive, this typology of meditation. So the attentional family of meditation, that relates to, again, attention. And this includes like the capacity to manipulate and orient sort of the aperture of attention and strengthen the awareness of the processes of thinking. And this brings me to the concept you might have heard of before called meta-awareness. So basically that means being aware of being aware, and having a sort of deliberate attention towards the contents of the conscious thought. And this idea of meta-awareness actually relates to all of the typologies, attentional, constructive, and deconstructive, but it plays a larger role in the attentional typology. And an example of this, perhaps some of you may know, is a breath meditation. So that would be considered attentional. And then the constructive family of meditation, that has to do with a reappraisal or perspective taking of psychological patterns of well-being. So an example of this you might have heard of is compassion meditation. So this has to do with cognitive reappraisal. And deconstructive meditation, that has to do with observing and exploring the dynamics of our own perception, emotion, and cognition. So that definitely sounds a bit abstract, but it is a typology, and actually that's how I first began my practice, which an example is, it's called a self-inquiry meditation. So it's a form of deconstructive meditation that looks into sort of dissecting, feelings. So example, feeling of anxiety, and sort of breaking it into component parts and looking at the physical sensations of the psychological content, you could say. And we know that motor and tactile sensations, those can be sort of traced in the brain regions. And also, scientists are now able to sort of look at brain regions when our kind of personal narrator is on, and our inner interpreter, you could say. So these are actually linked to certain brain regions. And actually 50% of our waking life is actually spent mind wandering. So, and this mind wandering isn't necessarily a negative thing, but the part of the brain that does mind wandering is also, or their parts, there's a sort of component of parts, is also the part of the brain that is active during anxiety. So meditation can help decrease sort of these behavioral indicators of mind wandering. And this relates again, it's strengthened by this idea of like meta-awareness, being aware of your awareness. So this can help impact the lessening of mind wandering. So my personal interest in meditation actually came at quite an early age. So you see there a picture of my high school research paper in my sophomore year, and it's called Personal Growth and Meditation. So even in my early years, I applied sort of a scientific interest in the effects of meditation. So now looking back at the thoughts of a 16-year-old, I'll just read you the first paragraph. It says, many people keep an inner dialogue in which they criticize themselves. Psychoanalysts refer to this self-criticism as the superego. An important change frequently brought about by meditation is the altering of the superego so that it becomes more flexible. So yeah, that's where my thoughts was writing about when I was 16. And I'm sure everybody can relate to that sort of concept of the inner critic. So I suppose when I was 16, I was sort of interested in dissecting that. And fast forward many decades, and I've become a certified mindfulness teacher. Of course, there are many developments between my sophomore year in high school and to my beginnings as a meditation instructor, but this talk will not go into that. So I am a full-time lighting designer, and I teach secular mindfulness meditation once a week. And I also belong to a community of Zen practitioners in which I'm not an instructor, but a member, somewhat more like a congregant, you can say. I also read many books and research papers about the subject of meditation and neuroscience and contemplative science. As I mentioned, there are thousands of published studies on meditation and brain science at many prominent institutions all over the world. I mentioned Harvard Medical School, but also at the University of Wisconsin, there's an amazing lab, and it was founded by Dr. Richard Davidson. So he's a researcher that I follow his research quite closely and read some of his sort of academic papers, as well as he's written some books for sort of general audience that you can go and get. So he's the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin, and he is a neuroscientist, but also a longtime meditator. And he researches sort of the neural basis of emotion and how this relates to human flourishing. So, and he employs, all sorts of methodologies and equipment, including MRIs and EEGs, tomography, etc. So his work has definitely been very inspiring for me in cognitive neuroscience. So I'm going to give a very, very, very brief overview of some of the effects of meditation on brain functioning. So the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the part of the brain, it's only in humans and other primates. So it's a more recent part of the brain. And in this part of the brain, it has to do with our executive functioning, working memory, planning, abstract reasoning, and also sort of inhibiting our inappropriate responses. So that's the DLPFC. And the default mode network. So this part of the brain, or parts of the brain, have to do with mind wandering. And the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex are part of this network of interacting brain regions. And there have been many studies about meditation and the default mode network, and those kind of findings all seem to point to sort of reduced activations of the default mode network. And that's a good thing. So it really helps to sort of relieve anxiety, right? So in a lot of severe mental illnesses, including schizophrenia, severe anxiety, PTSD, depression, the default mode network is actually sort of overactive and not well controlled by the FPCN. So MRI scans show this, and this is sort of one of the kind of initial investigations that neuroscientists have done with meditation. So, and meditation, mindfulness practice is known to sort of reduce the overactivity of the default mode network. And this is because there's sort of stronger connections between the executive functioning and this default mode network. And this helps to also sort of create attentional stability. So in other words, sometimes you're stressed out and you're sort of trying to concentrate on something, and these thoughts sort of pop in and pull you away from what you're trying to do. So that has to do with this kind of attentional stability. And so perhaps you might have heard of the amygdala. So that's kind of the part of the brain that has to do with fight or flight. So, and our emotional responses. And it, plays an important part with fear and anger. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that helps to sort of regulate the amygdala activities in humans. And also, in a lot of research on meditation, is the sort of lessened activation of the amygdala. And there have been, as I mentioned, if you Google or do a web search of meditation and neuroscience and brain health, you'll see lots of studies. Psoriasis, PTSD, addiction, ADHD, inflammation, panic attacks, other afflictions. So there have been studies in those areas, but by far the most widely published studies that have been validated are around depression, anxiety, and pain. So those three, I would say, are sort of the most studies have been published in that area. So here's just an image of some brain scans after 20 minutes of mindfulness meditation. So there are many of these that, again, you can just look online and find. And of course, in various published academic papers, there's tons of charts if you ever want to get more into this and the various regions. But meditation basically helps to sort of down-regulate the lower order brain activity. So, and advanced meditators have been known to feel less pain than non-meditators. So this has to do with different regions of the brain that relate to the sensations of pain and also sort of the emotional response to pain. And I could say, as a non-scientist, but as a person, well, scientists are people too, but before I got involved in any research about neuroscience or meditation, I still was a meditator. I used meditative techniques during childbirth, and I had 2 natural childbirths with no pain medication, and I used meditative techniques. So I certainly think that these are, in myself, certainly validated points in the relationship between pain and meditation, meditative techniques. And you might have heard of this word called neuroplasticity. It's also called brain plasticity, and has to do with rewiring of the brain. And in various meditation studies, you'll see things spoken of in terms of states or traits. So traits basically are sort of the more long-lasting changes to the brain, changes that are brought on by long-term practice that literally rewire the brain and alter the neural connections within the brain. So we looked at the connection between neuroscience and mindfulness meditation, and now we look very briefly at some of the people that are working in the field of neuroscience and architecture. So neuroarchitecture looks at the relationship between neuroscience and architecture, and how our nervous system, specifically our cognitive, and what are our cognitive and emotional responses. So again, I am certainly new to learning about this field, but I find it extremely fascinating. And it's a subfield of neuroaesthetics, and at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, within the Peterson Brain Science Institute, is what's called the International Arts and Mind Lab, a very interesting place. So I got to speak to a researcher there briefly, and just kind of get an idea of what they do. And it's definitely, interdisciplinary: science, art, technology, healthcare, education, community development. So they're looking at these topics in a very multidisciplinary way. But again, this is within the Peterson Brain Science Institute. So it's neuroarchitecture, which I said is sort of a subfield of neuroaesthetics. It's definitely a growing field, and I talked to a couple people in this field, but it's, again, very new for me. So in neuroaesthetics, they sort of break things down in terms of knowledge and meaning to sort of your sensory motor reactions to your emotional reactions. And in the field of neuroarchitecture, they are working on this premise, but within an architectural space, perhaps you spend more time than you would perhaps standing in front of a painting. So the way that they conduct the research is different. So one of the kind of foremost practitioners in this field is a fellow named Anjan Chatterjee, and he's at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. Again, I've just read some of his papers, but this is definitely a field that I'm hoping to learn more about and bring into the work that I do. I got to speak to a researcher who is the founder of a consulting firm that specializes in neuroscience applied to architecture. It's called Impronta. And Dr. Natalia Olszewska, she is one of the lead researchers that is specializing in neuroscience and architecture. So we had some conversations, which I'm hoping to continue to work with her. And she's definitely interested in lighting and how this plays a part in space and cognitive and emotional response. So one of the things she talked about, which I found really interesting, was, which I never knew about, is called the attention restoration theory. And that has to do with the importance of transition spaces. And I definitely agree with that on a sort of a intuitive basis, but there's studies kind of looking into this and how our neurological systems need these types of spaces. So there's definitely some topics I'd like to pick up with her, and she sent me some information just to show. I wanted to share just kind of as an exhibit to a map. This is her work. So it's a cognitive map, and they look at different spaces. And again, this is just a sort of a summary of an actual map, but you can see how they break down spaces and what the responses are on a cognitive level, but also on an emotional level, and looking at, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system and the various thresholds within a space. So I find this very interesting. So for my venturing in this various research areas and through my own practice and observations, I've started to build my own hypotheses which synthesizes these fields. And again, this is still experimental, and I'm just kind of at the beginnings of documenting these. So I've come up with qualities of mindfulness that could be translated into the design of space, in specific to the design of space with light and material interaction. So meaning, what is a quality of mindfulness, and how could these qualities be engendered within the design of light, space, and material? When I instruct meditation sessions, I emphasize spaciousness of mind. So the object of meditation is not to achieve some kind of perfect state of peace. Your mind is constantly in motion, and it just does what it does, just like how blood flows. So when we sit in meditation, we strive to give our thoughts space, kind of to air out our minds. So the mind, therefore, has a quality of spaciousness, as opposed to trying to achieve a quality of like perfect peace, right? So this idea of spaciousness. So when I think about this quality translated to design, I think about kind of blurred boundaries and diffusion. So this image here shows kind of rounded edges and diffuse surfaces. And in this image, the light is coming down, again, as diffuse. Both of these images are more conceptual and inspirational. I just wanted to sort of illustrate this concept. But I'll go into some examples of architectural projects and also some art projects. So this is an image of Philip Johnson's Crystal Cathedral, which underwent a massive renovation to become Christ Cathedral in Southern California, which our firm did the lighting design for. So this is an all-glass building, and for the remodeling of the space, so the shell was not altered, the all-glass shell, but an entire lighting and daylighting system was developed using these quatrefoil louvers, which also housed the electric lighting. So this in turn made a completely transparent space into a space that was more diffuse. So you could say that this sort of increased the contemplative nature of the space to make it more meditative. So here is an image, and this design of these louvers with, they have perforated material. This covers, the entire span of the space, over 900 panes of glass. So diffusion, contemplation, these qualities are evoked in this space. And the next quality of mindfulness that I've laid out is beyond ego. So when we're speaking of this in terms of the neurophysiological basis, this could be broken down into kind of quieting of the default mode network, which I talked about, that self-referential part of our brain processing. So in meditation, we're quieting these these circuits, sort of the self-referencing. And when I translate this into the design in the built environment, I think of this as switching foreground and background. So instead of an individual focusing on a thought, the thought is observed and sort of moved to the background instead of the foreground. And this quality of beyond ego can also be thought of as designing for a third space. So a third space, you can think of this as, an interstitial space, a space within a space, or perhaps a space with a diaphanous boundary, a space without a sort of task-related function, a space to be. In addition to being a lighting designer, I've also been commissioned to create art installations and light sculptures. And in 2018, I was asked to participate in 3 different art festivals, which explore some of these concepts of what I call third space and other qualities of light and meditation, which I will share with you. The Firefish Arts Festival, I created my first meditation village. This was a large sculptural installation, which I constructed a series of meditation pods, which you can see in the image here, with lighting. And the lighting is perhaps a central element of these structures. And this festival is spread out over about 10 blocks. And I created this temporary installation. It was up for 3 days, and it was at a former train station. So people were invited to enter the village for guided meditation. And to me, this is what I talked about before, this idea of a third space. And each of these meditation pyramids, they're made of copper, and they have this mesh backing with one face and single spotlight. So some of the elements of this piece were used in other installations, which I'll share with you. And this is sort of meant to invoke this quality of light and mind, and was kind of a deeper exploration for myself of this idea and how it materializes to me. And the next quality of meditation, which I'll translate into design, is stillness. So this is pretty self-explanatory. And in order to invoke this quality of stillness, there has to be a certain level of psychological safety. So spaces need to give people a feeling of psychological ownership. And then the other aspect, which is really quite simple but important, is a space to unplug and just get away from devices. So actually, when people come to my meditation class, they often say that it's one of the few places in their waking life where they actually don't have their phone right next to them. So for this installation, I created this kind of feeling of this sense of safety by simply bathing the whole room in this cool blue light. And this color kind of enveloped the room and made it feel sort of separate and safe. And here you can see a close-up of the screen element that I built on these meditation pyramids. And I'm using just a classical theatrical technique of lighting a scrim. So when it's front lit, it's more opaque. And when there's an object behind the screen or a person illuminated, then the screen is transparent. So therefore, the meditators in this temporary meditation village, they could feel safe and enclosed, yet not encased or trapped. So it's both transparent and opaque, depending on your perspective. So I led a meditation in this temporary environment for this large art festival. It's called Ingenuity Fest, and it was over 3 days. So I invited people to enter, and actually I often wonder if people were attracted to the meditation or the lighting. So I think perhaps more of the lighting, but they definitely, once they got in, they enjoyed the meditation. But I think it's the lighting that kind of beckoned them in. And you can see the light is singular and on each person, but it also doesn't separate. And now I'm going to switch the channel a bit and talk about an architectural lighting project in which will be my first design of sort of an amply sized, dedicated meditation space, and that also has sort of smaller meditation nooks. So I'm currently designing the lighting for a wonderful project in Pittsburgh for Carnegie Mellon University. It's their Health, Wellness, and Athletic Center. And there are athletic spaces, counseling spaces, worship spaces, clinical treatment rooms, meeting rooms. There's a wellness lab, prayer room, and some meditation nooks. So this is also my first large-scale project in which we will be installing circadian lighting with automatic color tuning throughout the day. So that's exciting. So we are not documenting WELL accreditation, but the lighting design will be designed to WELL version 2. And circadian lighting is also a big interest of mine and part of my practice. And this actually sort of got me further into this talk today. So I first started looking at lighting and health in terms of wake sleep cycles, and then I sort of wandered further down the path. So we're currently in the design of this project, and this is a visualization of a prayer room, which is a space that can be used for group meditation. And we don't have it featured here, but there's a big dome round ceiling, and it has color changing that's continuous around the perimeter. So this is also has this quality of diffusion and spaciousness and the third space. So I'll be looking forward to this being built. Will still be a couple years. And this summer I traveled a bit, and I wanted to sort of validate this idea and test out some of these theories by looking at some other meditation spaces. So I went to Crestone, Colorado, and I stayed at the Crestone Mountain Zen Center, which is an amazing place. And they have this building called the Lindisfarne Dome, which is it's on their land, and it is a multi-faith space designed by a fellow named Keith Critchlow. And it's hard to see in this one image, but it's a completely round space with a skylight, which is probably about 24 feet high. It's all wood, incredible acoustics in the space, and just an amazing space for meditation. So this definitely kind of evokes the feeling of safety and privacy, but definitely not feeling closed in. And the other big space of the property dedicated for meditation is the main meditation hall, or the Zendo it's called. And you can see here the interior. This is a Zen meditation center. So this is definitely a classic example of what a meditation hall looks like. And you can see that the light is from above. There's no view windows, but the light is coming up higher. And the final quality of meditation that I'll talk about is awareness. So earlier I talked about meta-awareness and sort of aware of being aware, this state of deliberate attention. So I translate this quality into the design of material and light as embodying texture and the sense perception of materiality. So actually this came to mind. I was riding my bicycle and I saw a sign that said grooves pavement ahead. So I thought, well, what's the purpose of the grooves in the road? And it's really to bring attention to what's happening around us, right? So light that highlights texture is a great example of a space that could evoke awareness. So in neuroarchitecture, this is a quality that's definitely being explored when designing spaces for specific, emotional response. Recently, I visited DIA, which is a wonderful art center in Beacon, New York. And there were 2 large rooms dedicated to an artist named Mary Corse, who's a light-based artist. She doesn't use electric light, but she's a major artist out of the light and space movement that originated in Southern California in the 1960s. So you could say her paintings are sort of imbued with light. And I was very struck by her pieces and their meditative qualities. And this further reinforced to me my hypothesis of texture as a quality of a meditative space. So here's an image of a large-scale painting, which essentially is an exploration in texture opening and invoking this third space. This is a close-up of her painting technique. And this is another image that I feel invokes this meditative aware space. Another view of her interaction with light and material on a surface. So mind wandering, yes, okay. So daydreaming, yes, as I mentioned, it's a form of mind wandering, but so is anxiety. So I hope that these qualities that I presented are evocative of a space that could perhaps help with anxiety. And when I talk about that, I don't necessarily mean a quality, a dreamy quality. So there is a distinction for these concepts that I'm trying to introduce. So more of an awake state rather than a dreamy quality. Spaces that affect awareness, attention. And this is also kind of what I talked about earlier, engendering a certain sort of neurological response. So you're awake and having this default mode network kind of quieted and the amygdala quieted. So awake, but not drifting off, not triggered by anxiety. So modern life. I brought up lots of different topics, and I just kind of wanted to summarize some of the ideas I've outlined. Spaciousness, beyond ego, stillness, awareness. So these are the qualities of mindfulness that I've presented and looked at how these translate to the design of light, space, and material. So spaciousness can be translated to the design that perhaps have less rigid boundaries, rounded or diaphanous or perforated, and also diffusion. And beyond ego can be translated to designs that have a foreground background switch. This would mean perhaps that one would not have a large sculptural, single luminaire as a focal point, no central focal point. This space could be designed as sort of a third space, which opens up, to a variety of interpretations. A space within a space with no central task orientation. And the quality of stillness is surely a meditative quality, and that could be translated simply into a space that is device-free, a space that doesn't have a kind of central narrative and has a sense of safety, perhaps where there's enough light to see, but there's also a sense of privacy. You saw in those meditation halls, there's no view windows, but there is light, natural light coming into the space. So spaces that could increase a sense of wonder, but also decrease the sense of uncertainty. And the final quality was awareness, which is central to mindfulness. So this can be engendered by using light and material to highlight texture as a central element, as opposed to an object with a texture. The texture itself is the main object, like those paintings of Mary Corse that I shared. So in meditation, it's a kind of a full body practice. So thoughts are, of equal importance as sensations, perceptions, and feeling. And my hope is that we can create architectural and also outdoor spaces that promote the sense of presence, places of non-doing or voids that we so greatly need for our cognitive and emotional health. So I'd like to thank you, and I hope I've inspired you to weave some of these practices into your own design practices. You can send some questions in, or if you are also interested to ask me offline, to send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn. I often answer messages on there pretty promptly. And also, if you are doing similar research or have an adjacent field and want to share any of your research, I'd love to hear that as well. So with that, I will be wrapping it up, and thank you very much.
What an incredible presentation. At this time, I'd like to remind you that in the interest of creating an optimal annual conference experience, we will not be holding a live Q&A session.